ParliON. We are one of Parliament's equality networks promoting social mobility in Parliament and equality of opportunity regardless of an employee's socio-economic background. We obviously have strong links with the Cross Whitehall Social Mobility Network, many of whose members are also joining us for today's event, who we're seeing arriving as we speak. And what an event. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Fiona Hill here today and thank her for, well, thank you for joining us at what is 8 o'clock in the morning in Washington. So
actually it's 9 because of the time.
9.
Yeah, just for this
9. Oh, well, then it's fine.
Only got a 4-hour time difference just this week.
So Fiona may have first come to the attention of those interested in social mobility when, during her testimony at Trump's first impeachment trial, she told the US Congress that the US offered her opportunities she would never have had in the UK. I'm just going to stop there and ask just to make sure everyone's on mute, because I've got some feedback. No, that's great. But yes, so Fiona gave testimony at Trump's first impeachment trial when she told the US Congress that the US offered her opportunities she would never have had in the UK. She said, "I grew up poor and with a very distinctive working class accent in England in the 1980s and 1990s. This would have impeded my professional development." Fiona's book, There's Nothing for You Here, published last month, documents her journey from the former coal mining town of Bishop Auckland in the northeast to the White House, where she has advised 3 former presidents on national security and Russia. But what is really important about this book is how it, well, really important for us, is how it explores the barriers to social mobility, the class and accent discrimination she faced, the opportunities she lost, and the support she had to take the opportunities she did. And as well as identifying the challenges, the book also looks at solutions, ending with ideas for making change. And from speaking with Fiona, it is clear that she doesn't see this book as the final product of her thinking about her life story and her research into social mobility, but rather a starting point, something to inspire conversation on this subject, to get people sharing experiences and ideas, to make people want to make a difference. And this is what we want to do with the event today. So we aren't just here to hear Fiona talk about her experience and ask questions. Oh no, we are here to have that conversation inspired by the themes in Fiona's book. We want to discuss the issues she raises and share ideas which will help Fiona in moving to the next phase with this work. So if Fiona talks about something which chimes with your experience, please put up your hand and share your story. If you agree with what she is saying or you disagree, let's have that discussion. Are you working on levelling up, for example, and want to share what you are doing? Please do. Use the chat bar. Put your hand up, come on screen. We want you to feel involved in this event. And these are the areas which we'll be talking about, which I will put in the chat bar now. So firstly, whether social mobility for people like Fiona from a working class background, here we go, from a working class background in the north of England has gotten worse or has gotten better or worse, and how. Number 2, impact of left behind areas on politics and national security. We'll also look at the government's levelling up policy, what the UK can learn from other countries, and intersectionality between social mobility and other issues like gender or race. So that's how we see this event panning out. And before, but I have to recognise that before we move on to that first discussion area, that not everyone here will have read Fiona's book or know Fiona's story, and it is a fascinating story. So I want to open by asking Fiona to briefly share her story, if she can tell us a bit about her background and the barriers and opportunities she was faced with on her journey to Washington. Is that okay, Fiona? Over to you.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, you can hear me okay, right?
Perfect.
Yeah, and I can see on screen, in addition to you, Claire, I think it's Julie Elliott, who I can see on the screen, so I'll say hello, and George Robertson, who I'm going to use as my jumping off point, because I can see him, and it's always, you know, a good thing in when you get you all started to have a nice friendly focal point to begin with, because Lord George Robertson former NATO and Secretary General and Defence Secretary in the UK and MP, known to me as George, played an instrumental role in my path to here. Because back when I ended up at university in St Andrews, which was the opening part of my journey from Bishop Auckland to Washington DC, and from, as I put it in the book, the coal house to the White House, I started studying Russian in 1984 against the backdrop of the miners' strike in the UK, as when I went to St Andrews, and that was, as people can imagine who can remember that time, what a, a time of incredible dislocation and strife and political upheaval. But it was also against the backdrop of 1984, George Orwell, Big Brother is watching you, the famous novel, and the Euro missile crisis, which George eventually gets involved in multiple ways in the defence ministry and also at NATO. At least towards the end of that, because my whole childhood and teenage years were and early years at university were dominated by this war scare, or the idea that we would have a nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we in the United Kingdom would be right in the middle of it. And I had a cousin, my mum's cousin, who was a local councillor in Darlington. She became a Greenham Common woman. We're celebrating the anniversary of the Greenham Common women right now, and she was in CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and everybody was protesting or panicking. I was panicking because I was a bit young to get out there in the protests. But that was the period where I decided to study Russian, because I wanted to understand what was going on. And I had another relative, a great uncle, although actually an older cousin. In the north of England, everyone's your uncle and aunt, because you never know, you might be related. I think it's the same in Scotland as well for George. Everyone's uncle or auntie, because you're just not sure. Everyone's been living in the same place for so long that chances are they're related to you, especially if they're older. And anyway, Uncle Charlie, who was in fact one of my dad's cousins, had been in the convoys to the Soviet Union during World War II in the Merchant Marine, and couldn't understand how we'd gone from being wartime allies to about to blow each other up with the Soviet Union. So he said, "Hey, Fiona, you've been studying languages at school. Go off and study Russian and figure it all out for us." So I set off on that path. And then partway through, when I'm at St Andrews and studying Russian, I have a panic attack, because I'm like, oh my God, I'm the daughter of a former coal miner. I'm from a working class background. What the heck am I going to do with Russian? What was I thinking? And I thought to myself, I'm not going to get a job. You see, this is part of the story of upward mobility. You get onto these paths, you come from this background, you have no markers on the road. You don't have anyone who's blazed a trail. So I went along to the career office at St Andrews thinking, okay, I thought I could be an interpreter. Maybe I could join the Foreign Service. And, maybe I could go to the United Nations as an interpreter and wear a headset, and kind of, or I could go to somewhere else to, help with interpretation. But what else could I do? How am I going to turn, kind of basically a degree in Russian and modern history into something where I can earn money? And so at the career service, they said, well, we have this alum. I mean, strictly, he was an alum from Dundee, because Dundee and St Andrews had sort of split apart. But he's very interested in Russian. He's an MP, and I'm sure if you wrote him a letter, he'd give you some advice. This was, of course, George Robertson, a Scottish MP who indeed was interested in Russia. He doesn't remember this, of course, but I remember it vividly, because I wrote a letter by hand. Dear Mr. Robertson, this is me. I'm studying Russian. Do you think this is a really daft idea? And I wrote off the letter, stuck it in the mail, thought, oh, well, that's the end of that. What am I going to do? Maybe kind of switch to something practical. I could take up accounting or something. A bit late now, but what am I going to get a job with? And he writes back. And this is, one of the messages of upward mobility. The kindness of strangers, who see themselves as mentors. And as George will tell people, his own story of upward mobility, although I didn't know this at the time. But he wrote back. It was a nice typed letter, but personally signed. It wasn't, auto pen or anything like this. And he gives me this advice and says that I should really, stick to studying Russian, because he has a feeling that this will, there's a turning point ahead. And of course, this is like 1985, 1986. Mikhail Gorbachev suddenly comes into office and everything changes in the Soviet Union. And suddenly all kinds of opportunities open up. And my pathway forward becomes one of timing and the kindness of somebody like George Robertson as a mentor, basically saying, stick at it. You know, you can do it. Don't worry. You know, I'm sure you'll be able to find a job out of this. And, you know, the rest of it is history, because I did stick at the at my studies. I didn't abandon it for accounting or something that might have led me to at least a guaranteed job. But it was incredible timing, because 1984, I didn't make the decision. 1985, Gorbachev comes along. We barrel towards the end of the Cold War. In 1987, I get a scholarship from the British Council. So again, what's instrumental here is scholarships and funding. And I get sent to Moscow for a year from 1987 to 1988. And it's the peak of the Cold War arms control cemetery. I'm there for the signing of the INF Treaty, which actually wraps up the sum of all of my fears of nuclear Armageddon, you know, from my teenage and early university years. Gorbachev and Reagan signed that. I see Gorbachev and Reagan in Moscow in 1988, and I just get hooked on everything. And then I find, you know, from another intervention by an American professor, that there are scholarships to Harvard and to other American universities. So I decide to apply. And miraculously, I get this scholarship to Harvard, 1989, just in time for the Berlin Wall to come down and the end of the Cold War. But all the way along the line, the secret to my mobility has been the intervention of someone, the changing times, because, you know, I also come along into education at the time when education in the United Kingdom is expanding. The comprehensive school system has, you know, just really taken off. And there's opportunities for kids like me from a working class background to go to university because it's paid for by my local education authority. So County Durham, you know, where I grew up, had retained, in spite of all of the problems of massive deindustrialisation, the loss of a tax base, its cultural and educational programmes. And I want to give a shout out for County Durham because they're currently applying for the UK City of Culture for 2025. I know they're competing with Stirling, George Robertson, but nonetheless, County Durham, not they're from Stirling, but close by. County Durham really did still invest heavily in people like me and students, and I had school exchange programs. I had all of my education paid for. They helped me with, you know, finding small bursaries and small grants. I had money from the Durham Miners Association, the local Rotary Club, all the way along to basically take advantage of educational opportunities. So education was the way forward. And at each point I had a grant and somebody to help me out. So just to wrap up quickly, networks like yours at Parliament, it's those networks and the people that play a very important role, allowing people not just to flourish, but to also be themselves. Because one of the reasons why I went to the United States was I still felt as if I didn't quite belong in the UK. Once I'd moved out of the northeast of England and I got myself to St Andrews, although it was very welcoming in terms of faculty and, you know, some of the other students, I still got a lot of discrimination about being from the north, about my accent, about my background. I talk in the book about the 3 questions that everybody would always ask, you know, where are you from? What did your dad do? Or what does your dad do? And where did you go to school? And in each case, when I'd say Bishop Auckland, County Durham, people go, oh, you know, if they'd heard of it, they knew, you know, this was a town that, you know, wasn't really remarkable for anything other than, you know, everybody losing their jobs. My dad had been a miner, and after all the coal mines closed and he tried the bricks works and the steel works, he became hospital porter. And at that point in the 1980s, the hospital porters were some of the worst paid people in the UK, and the NHS was always on strike for the auxiliary workers because they, you know, could barely make ends meet, as I knew firsthand. And then, you know, when I said I'd gone to Bishop Barrington Comprehensive School, I'd get the noses, you know, kind of turned away. And, you know, at one point, as I describe in the book, I was called a common northerner. People would say, well, what are you doing here? How did you get here? As if, you know, I had no right to, you know, be at university. And that was one of the things that compelled me once I got the scholarship to Harvard, even though I intended to go back to the UK. I mean, I actually applied to the Foreign Office. I think I told you, Claire, that my application got lost behind a radiator at the Foreign Office, along with someone else's. You know, I'd got to this kind of final selection, and my file, because it's the 1980s, of course, just fell behind a radiator and wasn't found for weeks. And then they said I'd have to apply next year, and I thought, oh my God, I need a job. I can't wait till next year. So fate took this weird hand of a radiator and, you know, the lost file, and I ended up staying in the States for an additional period. But once I was in the States, I realized no one cared about my accent. They just thought I was British. And fantastic, you know, kind of all kinds of doors opened that, you know, wouldn't have necessarily been at home. Nobody cared at all. In fact, they thought it was great that I was from the north of England. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that lovely? Everywhere in Britain is wonderful. You know, so the whole geographic distinctions and accent and class did not matter at all in the US, although gender and race did, as I, you know, kind of learned early on. Anyway, look, I'll stop there. But I want to thank again George Robertson and everybody else like him who helped me along the way, and you know, throw it back to you. And you know, really great to see so many people here as well. I'm just really appreciative people are giving up their lunch time to have this conversation.
But so many numbers, it's great. I'm going to ask Lord Robertson if he wants to come in and say anything, or is it?
Well, in a way, you know, I've got a strange accent as well, and I came from being born and brought up in a police station in a tiny village on the west of Scotland. So I never expected that I would end up in the White House like Fiona and in the Kremlin and in other places at all. So I, you know, and if you come from ParliON Primary School and Doon Grammar School, then you know, you're not going to be terribly socially mobile, although Doon Grammar School did produce the leader of the opposition and I think 3 members of parliament. And I remember one of them, Brian Wilson, saying, "We only have to get another 56 and we'll be upsides with Eton." So, you know, it was a territorial comprehensive school, so everybody went to that as well. But I tell students when I meet them, you know, or when I write to them as well, is that, you know, you've got to fight your way through the class system in the UK, you know, and take your chances when you get them, and that's what Fiona did. The breaks were there. You've got to work very hard, probably harder than other people, in order to be noticed as a consequence of that, and you've got to be lucky as well. So I went from being a geeky wee boy in ParliON Primary School with a squint in the eye and no self-confidence at all, to chairing international summits with George Bush and Vladimir Putin round the table. So, you know, along the way, I was helped by a lot of people. And the one piece of advice I would give, and Fiona, in a way, epitomizes that: ask people for advice. It's amazing how vain most people will be if somebody young and talented asks them for advice, and register with them, listen to what they say, learn from them at the same time. But get noticed, I think, is one of the things for good reasons. But the barriers are there, but the barriers, as Fiona and I have proven, you can get over.
That's brilliant, and great advice. And there's a few questions in the chat bar, but I'm going to come to Julie first. She has a hand up. Julie, if you want to come in.
Thank you very much, Claire. And I apologise in advance. There's an important statement coming in the chamber, so I'm not going to be able to stay for the whole session. But that was fascinating, Fiona, and it's lovely to hear you still have your northeastern accent. I'm from further north, from Sunderland, and a couple of years older than you, but I was born in County Durham. The boundaries changed, I didn't move. But what I wanted to say was, it's interesting because I joined the Labour Party in 1984 at that time of utter turmoil in the country and in the northeast. And listening to you, I mean, I was having babies and things when you were up doing Harvard and whatever else, but nobody at any point ever said you can become a politician as a working class woman, a miner's daughter from the northeast. It just was not suggested, mentioned, even in the ether. And I think your message about sticking at it and taking opportunities is absolutely right. I have to say, people still, when you travel, but they usually think my accent's Scottish, actually, George. So I'm somehow an honorary Scots person. It doesn't sound Scottish to me, but they still ask about what your dad did, and they still ask about where you went to school. So those things haven't changed. But they're not the barriers that I think there were even 20 years ago when I was starting out in politics. So I haven't read your book yet. I am going to read it in the Christmas recess when I've got some time. But I think role models are crucial to young women coming through, absolutely crucial. And you know, you are a role model to people. You've done things that people in the northeast of England, most women even now coming through school, wouldn't think I can end up in Washington doing the things you've done. So you writing the book and doing this kind of thing, I can't say how important that still is to encouraging young people and young women particularly to come through. And as George said, luck does play a part. You take your opportunities and you're not frightened to ask. Two crucial messages. So just wanted to say thank you so much. And as I say, I will disappear at some point when I've got to dash to the chamber, but I'm really sorry I can't stay for the whole thing.
Could I say something just in response to Julie there? Because you know, I'm really, you know, delighted to hear that, you know, you kind of burst out of Sunderland in that time frame. And my local MP in that time was Derek Foster, who's another person who played a really important role. And Derek Foster, of course, was from Sunderland originally. And as you said, it was County Durham until the boundaries changed and put you somewhere else. And Derek Foster got elected just in that kind of critical 1980s period when everything was closing down and, you know, Concert Steelworks had gone and the shipyards were going and all the mines were going and the railway works were going, the wagon works in Shildon next to where, you know, I was. I mean, everything was closing down. And Derek Foster himself had a hard scrabble life. And although he'd gone to grammar school, you know, like George, and then he'd gone on to Oxbridge and done PPE, which I did a little bash at in the book, I'm afraid, but sorry to everyone who's done PPE out there. He really believed in education, and that education was a gift and a privilege, but it was something you had to do something with. You had to use it if you got an education, because that's how he felt. And he made a point, that kind of old-fashioned, you know, Labour MP, of going to everybody's schools in his constituency in Bishop Auckland, you know, which wasn't that many, admittedly, but, you know, he went to every school. He tried to check in regularly. And he just basically told us, don't be bound by where you are. If you've got aspirations and opportunities, go out and take them, because you don't have to be, you know, basically confined by your place and, you know, your background, your school. You can, if you work hard, you can achieve something, but make sure always to give something back and pay it forward. And he, you know, had a really big impact on me. He was a super nice man. He talked, you know, quite openly that he'd had struggles as a younger person. He joined the Salvation Army, which had kind of sort of saved him from, you know, all kinds of personal demons. You know, he'd had a very difficult life, but he was an epitome of success. And, you know, just sharing a little bit about himself and telling us a story. I mean, that in a way is also a motivation for writing the book, because so many people, like for you, I'm sure, and for George, come and ask, well, how did you do it? And I thought, well, I did it with a lot of help, you know, and I want to actually tell other people how you can do it. And, you know, there are, I think, these networks, you know, people like you blazing a trail, because I didn't see a trail to politics, honestly, in the UK, because I mean, apart from my mum's cousin Dorothy, who was a, you know, councillor in Darlington, I didn't know women in politics. It was Margaret Thatcher, and there didn't seem to be like a ladder anyone who could, you know, follow behind Margaret Thatcher too easily. And there weren't a lot of women MPs at the time. I mean, there were some, but there weren't a lot. And in general political life, you didn't see a lot of women, particularly women from the northeast, but, you know, even people from the northeast, there wasn't, their accents had all changed. They'd got received pronunciation, you know, they'd been forced to conform. And so you couldn't tell that they were from Sunderland or Newcastle. And like you said, I've often been thought, in America, people thought I was Scottish as well, especially because I'd gone to St Andrews University. So, but inside the UK, people know the accent. And again, it's like, how did you get here? And instead of saying, oh, how did you get here? And, you know, how could we celebrate that and move it on? It's more like, what? Oh, hang on, how did you sneak in? And that wasn't a great kind of feeling. So I do hope that, you know, kind of by writing this, you know, like you said, that there's a sort of bit of a how-to manual there too, you know, about how can we all work together? Because I do think networking and helping everybody else along too, from all kinds of backgrounds, you know, because as I say in the book, there shouldn't be a wrong place to live or a wrong place to be from. You know, kind of when people say that's a good place to be from, meaning don't go back. I mean, that's not a great thing. And we need to be able to bring people in from every kind of diverse background into politics, really to, you know, tap into the vibrancy of the country, to great new ideas and different perspectives.
I think there's lots of really strong messages coming up of that, about role models like Julie was talking about, the interventions and having a kind of trail to follow that you've mentioned there. There's a few messages in the sidebar about Why does it have to be that when you come from an area and you have a strong accent, you have to leave the UK to progress? There are some other examples. I think Liz put down, she went to the Middle East and other places before coming back. And then there's a question from Sarah Ianu about whether you think it's problematic if the way to be socially mobile is to leave the place and community you started from. Doesn't this result in a brain drain to the southeast or elsewhere, and diminishing of the communities in the Midlands and the North? You know, it's kind of a problem that's coming out of this. And have you seen that in your research, Fiona?
Yes, I mean, certainly on the latter. I mean, look, in the former, I think, you know, George and Julie show that you can, you know, with, you know, some effort, overcome some of the, you know, accent, class and place barriers in the UK, but not en masse. I mean, you know, I think that, you know, George retaining his Scottish accent is more of a rarity. I mean, yes, you do have, you know, I mean, I hear a lot of other Scottish accents now in the UK, but they tend to be more muted. And so I've always sort of celebrated George, you know, kind of holding on to, you know, his accent and sounding recognisably George Robertson, as opposed to some sort of strange version of him. I love it when I watched you at NATO, George, where you'd have subtitles under every language, including English, when you were giving your presentations, because I had the same thing. You know, I'm just kind of making fun, but I had the same thing. And when I first came to the United States, people go, "Oh, I could listen to you all day, but I have no idea what you just said." And when I was doing the narration of the book for the audiobook, I had a director there deliberately just slow me down. You know, it's like to slow down. And now I've found that people who know me are speeding it up, because like, it doesn't sound like you. It sounds like somebody speaking really slowly, very strangely. You know, to speed it up back to your normal speech. But the brain drain is, I think, a big issue. I mean, I think, you know, now looking back, you know, if I'd been born somewhere else, I probably wouldn't have left the UK, because I mean, one of the reasons for leaving Bishop Auckland at the time when I did, and Julie would, you know, this would resonate with her in County Durham at the time and many other places, was just like the title of the book, you know, there's nothing for you here in terms of opportunity. It was hard to get the education, then to find something in the community to do with it, even, you know, teaching, nursing like my mum did. You know, there was limited capacity. Everybody can't be a teacher and a nurse. You know, there aren't all these workplaces. The retail sector was closing down. There was limited, you know, white collar professional jobs in the town and the region, because the tax base was disappearing and all the places of work were disappearing. I mean, it's hard to revitalize a place when there's no industry, you know, manufacturing and, you know, no business investment. But I do think now, you know, decades on with telecommuting, some of the decisions to move back departments of government in the UK in particular. I mean, the passport office is now in Durham. I recently renewed my passport and was very impressed by the efficiency of the people in Durham and getting it right back, and I could track it and everything. Before, it would just be sending it off and hoping for the best that eventually somebody might find my application for my passport and not drop it behind a radiator. But anyway, in that seems to be, you know, working and bringing, you know, people back to the communities. And I think all of these efforts now to sort of revitalise towns and high streets and thinking about the towns of the future, the cultural, you know, city of culture. There's lots of initiatives that you can see have promise and have some perspective in the UK, because the UK is relatively small, and people like you, George, I'm sure, you know, did a lot of commuting, you know, backwards and forwards. I mean, I know you kept, you know, on your house up in Scotland, and so the connections, you know, kind of can, particularly for MPs, I mean, if you're, you know, moving backwards and forwards, can be maintained. But overall, I think this is a point now where we can think about this more deeply, particularly in the UK context, given the relatively small size of the country. The United States is actually really difficult. And, you know, often moving federal government departments, like they moved the agricultural department in the US to Iowa, but it was done for political reasons rather than thinking about how to revitalise. This was during, you know, the previous administration, where there was a desire to dismantle the state rather than to kind of think about how to revitalise it and bring it, you know, kind of closer to the population, or, you know, kind of stemming a brain drain. It was more like, how do we get rid of some of these departments? Let's move it to Iowa so that all the people who work there don't want to go to Iowa, you know, for example. So we need to think about this kind of issue about how you stem the brain drain in a more serious fashion. And lots of countries are grappling with this right now too, including in Europe, particularly places like Germany and France, where they're also of a large size. But how can you bring government and more sort of sense of being closer to the fabric of the politics and the economics, closer to the places that people live?
I'm going to race on to some of our big questions, because we've already done half an hour. It's such a shame we haven't got more than an hour. There's so much to talk about. But you were talking about how important education has been to you, and the support you got to get into university. And there's some others who in the chat bar were saying they were the kind of the last years who got that funding for university, which is a big help with making that journey out of for you, out of Bishop Auckland, and you say in your book that your journey from Bishop Auckland, from the coal house to the White House, as you call it, is still an improbable journey, that you are the exception that proves the rule of how difficult it is to get ahead even today. Why do you think that social mobility for people in towns like Bishop Auckland hasn't improved, or could even have gotten worse? Do you think it might be education an issue? Sorry, go on.
No, but I think there's a couple of issues. I've been interested to see what Julie and George and other people think about this as well. I do think student debt is a huge barrier. I mean, in the United States, it's become an enormous burden, and it actually, in the United States, what happens with student debt is that you have to pay it no matter what your income is. I mean, you're basically always going to be liable for that debt. Whereas in the UK, there's an income component. So, if your wages aren't really high enough, it's not like your wages get, basically slashed immediately with the debt. They're kind of looking about ability to pay. And so there's a huge debate going on in the United States right now about increasing grants for first generation going to college, and figuring out how to give debt relief, to people who go into public service, public sector jobs. So, people at Parliament, for example, would count in that. And I do think that it's a massive obstacle for a lot of people to think about, God, I don't want to go off and do this course if I'm going to get this much in debt. I would not have gone to St Andrews if I'd had to take on debt. First of all, my family were frightened about debt. People from working class backgrounds, particularly in the generation I was growing up, debt was, I'd had a great grandfather who'd died in a Durham debtor's prison, kind of in his old age, because, there was no old age pension, back in the day, and everybody in the family remembered this and were very fearful. My mum still doesn't have a credit card. She has a direct debit card, and my entire family were frightened about debt, because that's just, the whole atmosphere that they grew up in. And I know, we've got more of a society now where people do accrue a lot of debt and credit cards and everything else. But I do think that there's that mental and, kind of realistic, barrier there to taking on large amounts of debt. And then there's aspirations. So it'd be interesting to hear from, George and Julie. I mean, George already talked about Dunoon, going to school, and the fact that people already, kind of had this expectation that if you got an education, you could move on to something. And I would say that, kind of with the old grammar school system and then the early parts of the comprehensive school system, there was certainly an expectation, in my family that if I did well at school, I could go on to college and university, or, Polytechnic at the time, or a technical training course if I wanted to. I mean, my mum had gone from a secondary modern to a nursing training. My dad had gone down the mines at 14. And for him, just education was not a pathway. Nobody gave him any chances, whatsoever. But there was a whole feeling, even in the old mining communities and, the Durham Miners Association, many of the unions, out of their dues that the miners and others paid, they had education societies. There are very famous, artists, writers, and all kinds of people who've emerged out of some of the workers' unions, and people getting educated through the old union system and then going on to further education colleges in the United Kingdom in particular, and then, going on to, all kinds of, professional jobs. So there was an idea that if you had those opportunities, the opportunities were there, you should take them. There was an aspirational element. Everybody that in my community was like, you go on, if you can do this, good on you. It's like, you're doing it for the rest of us. And that, I think, has shifted, because an awful lot of people are saying, well, I don't see the point in education. It's not for me. And I do know that from talking to educators in County Durham now, that they worry about kids in schools not having those aspirations anymore. You know, that kind of the generation has changed. They haven't seen anything new happening. It's decades since, you know, anybody has a memory of a kind of a more vibrant society. And it's just like, well, why should we bother? And then there's, you know, you get these reports from places like Durham University and elsewhere that, you know, people from the north who go there get discriminated against and made fun of still. And people say, well, I don't want that. You know, I don't want to go off to university where someone's going to make fun of my accent. You know, I'm just going to sort of stay around here. So there's a few things that are contributing, I think, to that pathway seeming more rocky and more difficult for people than it did before, even though in theory there's a lot more opportunity than, you know, there was back in the sort of 70s and 80s. But I'd be interested to see what George and Julie think about that.
Let me just make one point that, you know, so the school I went to, Dunoon Grammar School, which produced John Smith, who led the Labour Party, and others as well. And I found the debating society changed me dramatically. You know, I was a geeky sort of boy with a problem with the eye and very shy and retiring. Nobody believes that now, but it was a fact then. But the debating society gave me a degree of self-confidence and ability to argue in public. And as Fiona's book says, through life, you're going to be involved in interviews all the time. You know, and how you present yourself is going to be important. You can actually make something of your background, your underprivileged background, in order to make the case for yourself. You know, when I went to Dundee University 50 years ago, it was part of St Andrews University, so I know what Fiona's saying, filled with people who came from public schools. And the one thing that made them stand out from the rest of us was their supreme self-confidence. They weren't cleverer than us, they weren't abler than us, but they actually had that degree of self-confidence and the ability to project. So my advice to younger people is to get involved in speakers clubs. You know, you always try to articulate an argument if you can, because that will help you in pretty well every area of your future life. And you know, in Dunoon, I lived in a scheme, a council. You know, the private houses were in estates and the council houses were in a scheme. So I lived in a scheme that is now regarded as one of the most deprived in Europe. Round the corner from where I lived in a police house was a woman who became a professor at Oxford University. 4 doors along was a guy who opened the first Chinese department in a British university and is now running an institute in China, and who left school at the age of 15. 3 doors along from him was Stuart Houston, who played for Manchester United, and 2 doors along from there was a man who ran the National Geographic Film Unit. You know, so that was Dunoon at that time. You know, but as I say, I go back. Self-confidence is so important, and getting that degree of self-confidence is going to be a big passport to help people.
I think if I could just add something there, one of the problems we have now, when we grew up, you know, I lived in a council house, was born in a council house. My mum lived in it till the day she died. But my parents always supported me and wanted me to do well, and everybody's parents wanted the children to do well. And just like George, I can think of people across the estate who've gone on and done fantastic things. What we've got now in the northeast, which is a worry, education is although on the surface more accessible, tuition fees as they are now are causing problems, and people are thinking, do I really want that debt or do I not? That's an issue. I certainly wouldn't have gone to study, no question. But so people are more often studying and living at home, which I think, you know, diminishes their opportunities in many ways if you don't get the whole student experience. But also, I often hear with young people, and I go into schools as often as I can, where they don't want to take on that debt because they'll get a degree, but then they'll end up working in a call centre or something because there aren't the graduate jobs in the northeast. And it's kind of, why do I want to get all of that debt? Yes, get a qualification, but is it really going to advance me anymore? And the other thing is, with cyclical unemployment, where you're into often third generation unemployment, really, really different than our time, there's no aspiration within those households like there was in our kind of working class households. So I think there's almost parallel experiences going on who are people are coming from poorer families. So I think that the situation is much more complex than it was when we were growing up.
I think looking at those, the kind of the challenges that people have faced, I think it'd be interesting just to ask you, Fiona, about from your research, to kind of if you can give us comparisons with other countries, kind of looking at what kind of the UK could learn from European countries or others, or and also looking at the similarities and differences with the places that you've lived in and that you know so well, like Russia and the US.
Yeah, well, I mean, ironically, in Russia, the Soviet Union, when I got there, there was, real focus on social mobility. People had stopped believing in the Communist Party, but it was used as a kind of a network, a kind of a ladder up. So many of the kids that I was studying with when I got there in 1987, 1988, were kids like me from a working class background. Of course, the whole of the Soviet Union was pretty much working class, the kind of workers and the peasants, back in the day. But there was obvious pathways for them. Everything, all the education was free. There were, once you got a qualification, they'd help you find a job. I mean, that kind of scale of things isn't really kind of feasible. But you saw these kind of investments at that point in human capital. And, the Soviet Union is gone and Russia went through a whole load of problems, but there's still kind of a heavy investment by the Russians now in education. It's got a lot of issues with it, but you still see that. Germany is a great place to have a look at. And I recommended, actually inviting the German ambassador, Andreas Michaelis, who I know that George will know as well, to speak, because he comes from a similar background. And in Germany, there are all kinds of pathways, through education, but also through training and, kind of programs that really sort of celebrate people going onto apprenticeships and, different places and different ways into the workforce. And Germany also has the division between East and West, which is, vestige of the division of Germany into the GDR and, West Germany during the Cold War. But, those geographic divisions have been retained also between Northern and Southern Germany. And, they've got a lot of efforts now to kind of think about how they overcome that and try to kind of, create more opportunity overall. And, once they get through these coalition talks in Germany, the new government is very likely to put an emphasis on that. At the same time, as in the UK, people are talking about levelling up. In the United States, a lot of the interventions tend to be public-private on this. There isn't sort of a national social mobility task force, but there are a lot of, like in the United Kingdom as well, with the Sutton Trust and Rowntree and, a lot of other non-profit, private foundations. In the United States, that tends to be where a lot of the interventions are coming from, and also from universities. So somewhere like Harvard, where I went to graduate school, they spend an awful lot of time thinking about how to expand opportunity for people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds to come in. And they do think about socio-economic and geographic diversity, not just gender and race, ethnicity, and all the other, issues that get factored in. They get a lot of criticism, for maybe social engineering, but there is kind of an effort there, to try to bring more people into the mix and have a more diverse student body, and therefore diversification of opportunity. And I was a beneficiary of that for the graduate programs, because when I first got my Frank Knox Fellowship to Harvard, I was one of only 2 people who'd been to a comprehensive school, and the only person who was not from Oxbridge, when I, St Andrews, of course, is pretty high up there in the university rankings in the UK. But everybody else, it was like Oxbridge had a stranglehold on the Kennedy and Knox fellowships when I got there. So Harvard was even, trying to be mindful of that. And lots of colleges and universities in the United States, as I write in the book, have got programs now for people who are first generation coming into degree programs, trying to have them help them find funding. There's Pell Grants on a national level that the current administration is trying to increase the level of those grants. And so there's a lot of efforts to try to expand education but you know, it's like running up a hill. I mean, it's a hard job to do this. So I think, you know, when you're looking at it from the point of view of the UK, it's going to have to be a mix. It can't all just be top down from the government. You need to have, you know, public-private approaches. You also need the private sector, because one of the biggest problems in both the United States and the United Kingdom is people not having enough qualified workers for, you know, the next phase of our economies, green technology, artificial intelligence. It's going to be like another dislocation like the 1980s. We're going to have a whole new workforce that's required. So further educational colleges are going to be pretty key. I heard a presentation by Gillian Keegan, the government minister who covers, I guess it's talent and learning and skills. And she herself had come through industry, British industry, and also further educational colleges. So I think that that's going to have to, you know, play a role as well. You know, how do you kind of keep people reskilling? Like Julie was saying, a lot of people don't get jobs immediately after college, so they worry about it because they don't have the skills for the new workplace. You know, a degree in Russian and modern history wouldn't get me very far, you know, kind of in a manufacturing and an industrial job. You know, for example, in the knowledge economy, I'd have to, you know, get some other qualifications, for example, if I was, you know, starting out again. So I think we have to have a pretty holistic approach to all of this. And a lot of that can come from, you know, people generating ideas and networks like this and, you know, coming up with suggestions for moving forward.
We've got a really interesting question from Sarah Ionu again. Sorry, Sarah, calling on you for the second time. But what about the people who won't be able to escape their poverty through their intellects? Meritocracy is great, but it still leaves people behind.
Yeah, Sarah's really right about that. And I mean, I'd like to, you know, bring George in, you know, on this too, because for all of the people who are, you know, however many doors down in the scheme in, you know, in Dunoon, an awful lot of people who didn't go anywhere. Just like I have all kinds of friends who've made it. I've got a friend from school who took, you know, this long winding path and is now very senior at Rolls-Royce. But, you know, he didn't, you know, start off going down the university path. He did the local technical college and all kinds of apprenticeships. I talk about my mum's godson who, you know, left school and went to work for, you know, one of the big shipbuilding companies, which immediately closed. And then, you know, he got retrained, but did a degree through the Open University, you know, all this kind of different pathways. But for all of those success stories, I've got, you know, people I went to school with from elementary and secondary school who've never had a job, not for any, you know, kind of meaningful length of time. I remember, you know, years after I you know, moved to DC, so probably in the last 20 years, going back home and running into somebody who'd been in my class at school, really, you know, great person, and the only job that they'd had for an length of time was in a coat hanger factory, which had closed. And, you know, I felt really bad about it, and, you know, kind of thinking about, well, they also couldn't move. So it wasn't one of these issues. It's like my dad couldn't really move any further because he was responsible for looking after his parents, and it was the same for this friend from school, whose parents were dependent and on him as well. And they were basically, you know, I wouldn't say trapped because they wanted to stay, but they were trapped by the fact that they couldn't find anything permanent, you know, not for want of trying, but it was just the circumstances around, you know, limited opportunities to, you know, get transportation. They still didn't own a car because they couldn't afford one. My family never had a car, for example. So there's physical mobility problems. How do you get from A to B to get a job? And that's, I think, going to have to be part of the levelling up agenda, because the government, both at the national level and the regional level, has to think about that. And you and I, Claire, when we were talking before, we're talking about how difficult it is to get around the UK because lots of places are not connected. All roads lead to London. So just as a little vignette, I'm trying to get home to see my mum between Christmas and New Year. I can't for the life of me figure out how the hell to get there. I can get to London, fine. But if I want to get to Newcastle, or to Teesside, where in theory there's an airport, I can't find any planes that seem to fly to it anymore, and it got closed down for lots of times. And Middlesbrough, Durham, you know, all have this Teesside airport. Well, anyway, it's pretty much not functioning. I either have to fly through Amsterdam, and, you know, good luck trying to get a flight, you know, to Newcastle or Teesside. But I can't, there's no flights, you know, kind of anymore. Internally, they get me anywhere near to my home. So the only way is getting into London, taking, you know, kind of a tube or the car all the way across, you know, to King's Cross and then, you know, to the train. That's actually, you know, a real problem. If you think about, you might be a business person, you know, wanting to maybe invest in the region. If you can't get, there from here, from wherever here is, that's already a barrier, to thinking about how you revitalize the regions. And tickets are really expensive, on the trains. Not every person's going to take the bus, from Victoria train station to wherever. There's just lots of places in Britain that are completely cut off from each other unless you have a car. And so that becomes, again, another barrier.
So there's a brilliant train service, come on, Fiona, from London to Newcastle. You can live in some rural parts, I think, of England and Scotland, where it's very difficult to get to. But as long as you can get from Heathrow across to King's Cross, it's not about...
County Durham, Newcastle isn't that easy to get to, again, without a car. I've already tried to factor this out. So this is kind of part of the point that I'm saying is a lot of the big cities are connected, but it's that smaller level places that voted for Brexit, and a lot of the places that changed their votes from one party to the other in 2019, they're all cut off from each other. Good luck getting to Sunderland, by airplane, or there's many of these places. So yes, in theory you can, but when you start to try to do it in practice, that's why I'm saying there's a lot of barriers. So part of levelling up is going to have to be thinking about regional transportation as well, because not everyone can afford a car. Particularly as we move into all the AI technology, cars are going to become more and more expensive, for example. And so, ride shares, lots of places don't have taxi, regular. You can't go out in the street and just, hail a taxi. You have to be able to call a taxi. There's just a lot of physical mobility problems that really kind of tap in, I think, to this larger issue. Yes, you can, theory, get to places, but when you try to do it in practice, it's often more difficult than you think if you're not going to a regional hub.
This moves nicely into kind of the next area I wanted to talk about when you were talking about the physical mobility causing issues with places being left behind that then voted for Brexit, and you saw in the US that voted for Trump, and you've said in your book that these left behind areas could become national security issues, and I was just hoping you could elaborate on that a bit for us.
Yeah, because look, we've already seen how people really have a propensity of conspiracy theories, kind of for polarized politics. I mean, in the United States, it's pretty acute right now. I'm sure everyone's watching with a bit of horror, kind of from the outside. A lot of our elections now are being driven by a lie that, President Trump is still president, and that he won the 2020 election and it was stolen from him by Biden. A lot of people will just not admit that Biden is the president, for example. And we're having local and regional elections, including in Virginia, right just next door to me here, that are being kind of run on the basis of lies. Youngkin, the kind of one of the major candidates in Virginia, for example, ran on the back of education, basically saying that critical race theory was an anathema, for just basically American history, their kind of history of race in the United States, which is a fact, but it's basically saying it shouldn't be taught in Virginia schools. That was making white people feel bad about themselves. It isn't even taught in Virginia schools. So it was like a total lie and a red herring at the best, to kind of saying we've got to stop this in our schools. Well, it'd be easy to say we stopped it because it wasn't taught there anyway. So that this is kind of part of the problem that we have that fits into not just left behind places, but people feeling that they're not participating fully in the politics. You get the polarization, the grievances that can be tapped into. And when you have a lack of education, a lack of knowledge, people can spin anything. And then how does it become a national security crisis? We saw that in 2016 in the United States. We saw a bit of it in the UK with Brexit, with the Russians and RT and their propaganda, Russia Today and their propaganda, and trying to kind of air a lot of the grievances that were surrounding Brexit and amplify a lot of the misinformation and deliberate disinformation. But in 2016, what the Russians did is they had intelligence operatives and people that they'd hired pose as Americans on the internet, on Facebook and many of the other social media sites, and just sow more discord, sending around the kind of information that people are sending amongst themselves, but amplifying it and more. And that's kind of one of the biggest successes of their influence operations, was basically stirring it up on a massive scale. And so at this point, one could argue whether the United States in particular has become ungovernable, and the Russians were sort of piling on these issues. And one of the the goals of the Russian campaign in 2016 was to have people lose faith in their democratic system. Well, people have lost faith in the democratic system. It's arguable as to whether, kind of the Russians had the instrumental role in that, or whether it's just, the rest of the politics. But they've definitely been able to exploit it and trying to, basically undermine United States leadership. And this will be the same for, the UK as well in, in the international arena. So, and it also, we're not competitive as societies and economies in the same way either. Because, China has made huge investments in its education and in training to bring, people out of poverty, to also create a new workforce for the 21st century. And you can certainly say, even if you want to criticize how the Chinese run their government, which, there's plenty of room for criticism there, they certainly have capacity for collective action. And right now, our societies have, particularly the United States, much less capacity for collective action, for making change internally. Glasgow and COP26, we could see that we need, kind of the advanced Western countries to step up to be able to move forward on climate change. But while we're arguing about among ourselves, particularly in the US, whether there even is climate change, then we're obviously not going to get anywhere. So there's many dimensions to this, but the internal dysfunction, the domestic dysfunction, makes it very difficult to do anything on the international stage.
And before we kind of draw this to a close, because we're coming up to 2 o'clock, I did want to ask about, as we come to the end of, or we've just had Black History Month, and a lot of us attend events here. Parliament put on a lot of events that got us thinking about the issues for how race can affect a person's experience and their access to opportunities. And there's clearly intersectionality between social mobility and issues such as race and also gender. Do you have a view on the best way to deal with that and the kind of the best approach to improve social mobility while also acknowledging these other issues?
I think it has to be and. I mean, we have to recognise that there is just a very high level of discrimination, against people based on their race, ethnicity, and gender. And when those come together, that's of course double or triple, disadvantage. But geography and class, because class does still exist, do play a large role in this as well as additional levels of disadvantage. And if you are, someone, who's black and British, living in one of the deprived areas of the north or coastal areas that have, lost their industry, you're going to be a lot worse off, than somebody else would be there. But the point is, an awful lot of these areas tend to be predominantly white. So I think, that often people don't see, the kind of the effect of this intersectionality. So Bishop Auckland, where I grew up, remains predominantly white, and lots of Scotland does as well. In fact, I think, overall Scotland's something about 96%, white, and 98%, for example, in somewhere like Bishop Auckland and the rest of County Durham. It's really in London that's kind of like the crucible of diversity, but even between boroughs, you see a difference here. So I think we have to figure out how we can factor in the geography or the geographic, the inequality as well, and including in London. There's a big difference between Kensington and Tower Hamlets, for example, that people have to address. And I think, the UK has actually done a really good job in comparison with where it was when I left in the 1980s of factoring in for race and gender, disability, and and other issues, or kind of about personal identity and kind of personal circumstances that throw up barriers. But it's done a lot less on figuring out how geography, in spatial inequality, as the kind of technical term, fits into that. So how you can address that and everything else is important. It's not either or. It's just how do all of these factors come together. So I think, getting a few individuals to talk about it. I was very drawn to much of the commentary by David Olusoga, in his book Black and British, for example, which, was really a revelation to me. I mean, I kept thinking about what was it like for him, from a white working class family on his mother's side and, black Nigerian immigrant on his father's side, growing up in a council estate in the northeast of England at the same time that I'm growing up there. That's whole dimensions of difficulty. that I, you know, for example, didn't experience at all. He had everything that I experienced and then some, you know, because he also had a sister who must have experienced, you know, the gender, you know, discrimination as well. And I think getting people to talk about all of that, how it all comes together, is very important. You know, and I was sort of, you know, hoping, you know, that this might spark off about how does this all, you know, kind of come, you know, to a point where we can address all of these, because you shouldn't kind of play one side off against another. There's all kinds of elements of disadvantage. So how do you, you know, steadily remove all of the barriers for individuals, but also for groups writ large? I don't know whether George has any, you know, thoughts about that, you know, along the way, but, you know, there's just added dimensions of difficulty for people, you know, when you, you know, add, as you said, this kind of intersection of gender, race, background, you know, and not just socioeconomic background, but geographic, you know, background as well.
Just a final brief comment. I noticed that in the chat, somebody's saying it's not what you know, it's who you know. Now, that's perfectly true. So the more people you know, the better chances you're going to have. And therefore, young people should get involved in as many organizations as possible in the third sector, even the political parties. Get to know as many people as possible, because that will multiply your chances of being somebody who is noticed among it. You know, the idea that you rely totally and completely on exam results or on merit has never applied, and it will never apply in the future. So that applies right across the social strata. But anyway, you're brilliant, Fiona. I hope everybody on this call buys your book, because it's a wonderful story, a great tale. The stuff from the White House is absolutely shocking and frightening, but it's also inspirational, and I think everybody can learn from it.
Oh, thanks, George. And look, I just want to add to this. I mean, look, this network that you've created here, you know, Claire and all of your colleagues. I mean, this is what George is saying, because it's who you know, right? And exactly, because I didn't read the chat. I'd had to stare at it with my specs on. You know, I can't see very well. And you know, I think that we need cross-generational, cross-racial, you know, cross-gender, cross-geographic coalitions. These kinds of networks are what's going to make the difference. You know, I was a joiner as a kid. Sometimes I didn't want to join some of the groups. My mum forced me into the Girl Guides, you know, for example. But, you know, I did, you know, every imaginable youth group. Even though I couldn't really sing or play the violin very well, I joined, you know, youth orchestra, youth choir. All of these networks, they were what helped me. And, you know, it was just a kind of as George says, how can you expand out your contacts? Because as I mentioned in the book, poor kids are contact poor. That's why they're poor. And a lot of the communities that got destroyed in the 1980s, you know, with the Durham Miners Association, you know, which has sort of disappeared, you know, even like local Rotary clubs, you know, when the tax base disappeared, they shrank. You know, all these kind of community fabric, that was important for people moving ahead. You know, I'm sure in Dunoon, you know, kind of back in the day when people were in work, you know, the kind of the workplace created communities, including for people's kids. So we've got to recreate them. And this kind of network is exactly, you know, what people need. So they know more people, they have those contacts, and that network will help everyone get ahead.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I think we could talk for so much longer. It's such a shame, there's so much to say, but we've covered so many areas: the importance of role models, of support, of networks, of education, of aspiration that we need to bring back. We've looked a bit at levelling up and taking inspiration from places like Germany, and the importance of physical mobility and the impact that plays, and also intersectionality. So we've gone over quite a lot in this hour, and like you said, there's been a lot in the chat bar, a lot of people making comments, which I think it's important to record. So I will take a copy of that, and I will send that out when I send out the recording to the networks and others. But just to say a massive thank you to Fiona. That's just been brilliant, and to Lord Robertson for all your contributions as well. I hope I could see, you know, from the comments that everyone has enjoyed it. I've put a link in the chat to the book. Go out and get it if you haven't already. It's a brilliant read. But yes, so thank you, everybody, and I hopefully see you at another event in the near future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. All the best wishes to everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.